This is the moment in which we need to assert the value of multilateralism. This is the moment in which we need to recognize that only global solutions can address global problems, and that the UN is the cornerstone of that multilateral approach.
Former Portuguese Prime Minister Antonio Guterres is now at the helm of the United Nations. We'll explore his vision and the enormous challenges for the World Organization. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. Earlier this month, the United Nations welcomed Antonio Guterres as its new Secretary General following the end of Ban Ki-moon's term. Guterres served as the UN High Commissioner for Refugees for 10 years and is the former Prime Minister of Portugal. He inherits a daunting list of international conflicts from Syria to Yemen and South Sudan. But who is Antonio Guterres and how equipped will he be to take on these challenges? Our UN correspondent Liling Tan reports.
I, Antonio Guterres,
taking the oath of office as the 9th Secretary-General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres pledged to do all he can to fix the UN from within and without.
the UN must be ready to change. Our most serious shortcoming, and here I refer to the entire international community, is our inability to prevent crises.
There are high hopes that he's the right man for the job. As the former Prime Minister of Portugal and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Guterres is both a politician and a humanitarian.
When he was leading the refugee organization, that was a transformational shift for us because it changed the way we spoke about refugees. He's also a person who knows politics well, and he was able to broker political consensus in situations that were very tense and difficult.
He's regarded by many world leaders as an honest broker, but also by his colleagues as a man of heart.
I give you this example. We saw a child who had, he was deaf and he could not hear. And we simply could not afford the medical services in order to give him hearing. As soon as we walk out of that family, he said, I want that fixed and you charge it to me.
But there are no easy fixes for the problems Guterres will face as UN chief. The Syrian conflict is entering its 6th year. The threat of genocide looms over Burundi and South Sudan. Pyongyang's nuclear ambitions remain unabated. And there's global terrorism, the refugee crisis, climate change, and a UN peacekeeping system plagued with scandals.
I feel sorry that I have to leave so many unfulfilled issues to my successor and member states.
It's a daunting task at a daunting time.
I cannot imagine a more thankless job than being Secretary General of the United Nations, because there are always going to be serious problems, both on a global scale, a regional scale, and also a more micro scale. We should not expect the Secretary General to solve the world's problems, but we should expect him to try.
One thing already going for Guterres, he won over an often divided Security Council to clinch the top UN job in the most transparent and grueling selection process in UN history. Liling Tan, New York.
Joining us now from Beijing is Zhang Xiaoan. She's the former vice president of the UN Association of China. From Beirut, we're joined by Raghida Dergham. She's a columnist and senior diplomatic correspondent for the London-based newspaper Hayat. Here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio is Chris Whatley. He is the executive director of the United Nations Association of the United States. And from New York, we're joined by Hugh Dugan. He's an international affairs scholar and expert on the United States' participation at the United Nations. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Raghida, let me start with you. Antonio Guterres, who now has the top job at the UN, is no stranger, of course, to that world body. He's been the head of that organization's refugee agency for the past 10 years. What can you tell us about his track record there and what he brings to the job now?
Well, of course, if you take a look at the refugees situation in the world, it's not a very good one, but it's not the fault of Guterres himself. It is the fault of what's going on by politicians, countries, leaders taking the wrong decisions. But he has been a man of the field. He is politically savvy. He is a man who has been able to gather consensus around him in the time of division amongst members of the Security Council in particular. And, you know, he is not a bureaucrat. He is going to be, like your report said, a broker. And he comes with something new in the aftermath of the last Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Ban Ki-moon was more aloof, and he was always sort of more planned, if you will. He was more with his notes. He followed the talking points. I think Antonio Guterres will be speaking from the heart and from the mind, because he's very well equipped to do that in this international atmosphere.
Hugh, what do you make of Antonio Guterres? You know, as Raghida just told us, he's politically savvy, but he's also been described as a humanitarian. And he comes to the office right now when the world is facing some major challenges. We've talked about some of them, you know, the refugee crisis, conflicts around the world, climate change, political change around the world. So what kind of vision does he bring to this?
Well, I think Raghida stated it well, and I think what really needs to be stated up front too is that his chief job there, his principal job, is as the chief administrative officer of a very complicated corporation, which is the United Nations organization, with its thousands of members, staff, and its myriad of challenges and bureaucracy. To the extent he's not a bureaucrat is maybe not his strength in this case, because indeed you have to muster the resources to implement the types of outcomes that the member states decide when they sit and negotiate together. I think ultimately every Secretary General is judged on how well he managed his relationship with the Security Council, which is the home of the 5 most powerful countries who sit as permanent members, and again, another 10 members. That is a critical feature for every Secretary General, to maintain good relations with the Council so that he's able to bring them together when they might not be close together. He's able to identify the resources that he has so that their expectations and their decisions are well within the bounds of what the UN can deliver ultimately.
Right, you've talked about what he needs, Hugh, but does he have those powers of persuasion as far as you know?
Well, this is a good opportunity to remember, and I'll be the first to say it here today. Will he be more secretary or more general? He actually has 2 major functions in this role. First is to be secretary, to administer the needs of the member states, support them. Second is general, and does that mean, does he offer his advice to his 193 bosses? He has that many bosses. 193 equal sovereign member states of the organization have a say over his role. In fact, they appointed him, they selected him and recruited, and now are going to employ him. So yes, it's a delicate balancing act. Can he deliver as an administrator, and can he also cajole the member states politically when he sees the need to do so, and to remind them of the resources that they've given him to work with, so that whatever is decided is going to possibly occur.
Zhang Xiaoan, the Secretary General, the new Secretary General, met with the Chinese President Xi Jinping in November in China. What did that visit accomplish, and what is China's view of the new Secretary General?
I think the most important achievement of this visit is that he has got the firm support from China. As we know that the Secretary General's mission will be impossible without the support of the member states, especially the key member states. So Guterres, before he took office, he paid some visit to some of the key countries to exchange views and also to get support, and China was one of them. And Guterres, he attaches great importance to the role of China in the UN, and it is crucial to get support from China. So when he visited China, President Xi Jinping met him and also assured him that China would be the firm supporter of the UN cause. And also China will be the firm supporter of multilateralism. Xi Jinping also confirmed that China will fulfill the commitments made in 2015 during the UN anniversary, 70th anniversary. So China, I think, with this strong support, will give a great help to Guterres in his future work.
Right. Chris, Mr. Guterres has taken office at a very significant time, because we have Donald Trump, who's going to become president of the United States in just a few days. It's not often that we have the leader of the UN and the leader of the United States taking office within a few weeks of each other. Mr. Trump has made clear his disdain for the United Nations. I want you to take a listen to what he said. Let's watch this.
The UN has such tremendous potential, not living up to its potential. There is such tremendous potential, but it is not living up. When do you see the United Nations solving problems? They don't. They cause problems. So if it lives up to the potential, it's a great thing, and if it doesn't, it's a waste of time and money.
So there we have Donald Trump saying that the UN has potential, but how does Mr. Guterres convince and persuade Mr. Trump that the UN is relevant, that it should be supported?
Well, certainly the UN right now in this time of transition and here in Washington on Capitol Hill is the subject of considerable controversy. And I think that harkens back to a little bit of what Hugh said. Hugh said that the public judges the UN by or judges the performance of the Secretary General by his relationship with the Security Council. And the American public and our Congress tend to judge the UN's performance by what happens in the Security Council. And certainly we had a controversial resolution on Israeli settlements come out of the Security Council at the end of last year. That has informed the debate that we're having in Washington. But ultimately, the UN itself, this institution that was created at the end of World War II to manage interstate conflict, spends its time and attention mitigating state failure, dealing with complex humanitarian emergencies. And there is broad consensus in the American public that that's in our interest. 88% of the American people think that we should be working with the UN and our allies to manage those kind of crises that affect us, that affect our national interest. So I think ultimately we're going to find an administration that finds ways to work with the UN. It's too early to tell what that relationship's going to look like, but I think the Secretary General is well positioned to lead that relationship and to work constructively with the new administration.
Right. Raghida, how does the new Secretary General attack and try and resolve some of these very complex problems? Chris just mentioned the resolution that was just passed in the Security Council condemning Israeli settlements. I wanted you to just take a listen to the response that came from the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, and then I've got a question on that. Let's watch this.
I remind you that we have pulled out from Gaza, uprooted settlements, took people out from villages. Did it help us in the UN? Did it improve the attitude in the UN? We've received thousands of rockets, and we've received the Goldstone report in the UN. So I tell you what I know is clear to most Israelis. We have learned this lesson. We are not going there again.
So Raghida, can the new Secretary General undo this logjam? It's been decades in the making.
The Israeli Prime Minister could spin this in any way he wishes to. Settlements are illegal and they are an obstacle to the two-state solution, and that is why there was a consensus around that last resolution in the Security Council. Whether his supporters in Washington are going to see this as a problem for the UN, it is not going to affect the fact that there is a consensus to say, and it's not new policy for the United States, by the way. It's an old policy that settlements have been an impediment. Many presidents have taken action against Israel because of the settlements. So, no, it's not going to be Antonio Guterres' task to walk away from this resolution on settlements. Not at all. I think, in fact, there's going to be more challenges on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and I think the bigger problem right now for Antonio Guterres is going to remain what to do about Syria. This is where war crimes have been committed. This is where the big deal is going to be made. This is where the big problem of the refugees is boiling. And this is when the challenge for Antonio Guterres about accountability. What do you do about accountability? What do you do about war crimes? What do you say in your reports to the Security Council, to the General Assembly about what had happened in Syria, about the fight that's going on in Mosul against Daesh, and what the aftermath it's going to leave in terms of the more refugees? This is his priority right now until politically it's clearer.
Right, major challenges he will face. Hugh, every time we have a new Secretary General at the United Nations, we hear calls for reform within that world organization. The bureaucracy is too big. We've heard that from Guterres himself. Let's take a listen to what he said about reform.
We need to try to get rid of this straitjacket of bureaucracy that makes our life so difficult in many of the things we do. And this requires a lot of effort from ourselves, but this also requires a lot of discussion and dialogue and mutual understanding with member states, and to overcome many of the divides that still exist within the organization.
So, Hugh, these reforms that he's talking about, what do you think are going to be his priorities at the UN?
Well, as Raghida was saying, and as most of the world regards the Secretary General as having some sort of independent political authority, but he has to earn that respect by the member states. It's not an automatic thing. His principal job, as defined by the Charter, is as Chief Administrative Officer. And as insurmountable as some of the challenges are in being that Chief Administrative Officer over such a complex organization, he will only get the respect of member states, principally the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, to have some independent political authority if he can show that he can master the political machinery that he's managing. So indeed, I believe reform is job one. I use the word reform when we should really say effective stewardship of the resources of this very interesting international machine that we created 71 years ago. So his stewardship of these resources depends upon the member states, depends upon their active involvement. It's called the United Nations, not the United Secretariat. So the ultimate responsibility resides with the member states to take a reform mentality to the organization every day, look for results, look for outcomes, not just outputs, and give him the wherewithal to act as a Chief Administrative Officer, growing his authority therein, and then being able to speak all the more authoritatively as an independent political authority, too.
Zhang Xiaoan, China has supported and contributed to many of the UN's initiatives like sustainable development, poverty reduction, climate change, peacekeeping operations. China plays a big role in that. Now, Guterres said in a recent interview with this network that he hopes that that relationship with China will expand, that it will get even better. How do you see that unfold in the years ahead?
Yes, I think China has made very big contributions to the UN initiatives in the areas you just mentioned. And I think the UN also expects China to continue its effort in those areas. But at the same time, UN also expects China to play a bigger role in the conflict prevention, conflict management, and conflict solution. And Guterres, he hopes that China could play a bigger role in the mediation. As he was said in China, that China has no special interest to protect in the conflict. So China could be an honest broker. And he strongly appealed that China could engage more and more as a global mediator to bring different parties together to find a political solution.
I quite agree, and since China's role at the UN has grown commensurate with its role in the world these last 30 years, it's quite impressive to see the interest and the effort and the skill they bring to the United Nations every day, because they realize that this is a place where multipolarity can speak in a world that otherwise might look like it's unipolar. China has an important role to play, and it's stepping up to that. It's very impressive to see what they're doing. They've initiated a new UN Peace and Development Trust Fund on their own and have offered $1 billion toward that fund, which is quite impressive. So the modernization of China is very evident at the UN, and of the new Secretary General, I expect that they're going to need to see him bring all the different sounds of the organization together in harmony of sorts, where this multipolarity can prevail as international decision-making depends.